thanks to GCSB for hosting this. I think it's great to bring so many different perspectives together in this discussion in the security context. One of the first policy responses to COVID has been school closures, and they do have an effect on the spread of the virus, but actually it's quite modest. The action has been quite drastic with strong consequences for children, whereas the benefits, compared with household quarantine, case isolation, and so on, are limited. And I think we should be conscious of this to balance the short-term costs and the long-term benefits of those kinds of policies. If you think about it, we have basically 1.5 billion students and their parents affected by school closures currently. Of course, remote learning has come into play. It has worked for some students, but certainly doesn't address the many social functions of education. And of course, as you imagine, access, use, and quality of online resources have further amplified inequality. For young people with access to technology who are well prepared to learn on their own, who have parental support, this is all liberating and exciting. But for people without access, without preparation, without support, they're left further behind. I think that's something of real concern. Accreditation, is at stake. We do not know how to certify and recognize learning, which risks leaving a generation of young people stigmatized, and so on. That's basically the reality, and schools will be reopening, and that's already happening in a number of countries, but there are significant disruptions that are likely to remain permanent. Obviously, funding is going to be an issue. The global recession will hit middle and low income countries hardest, but first directly domestically, but also in terms of reduced foreign aid flows. That's already been an issue before the crisis, so certainly going to be amplified. And we also know that the scenario of just returning to the status quo is not what anybody would want, because that status quo hasn't been working before for many countries, and certainly will not mean reaching SDG 4 on education. So this is also the time to think harder about how to raise productivity, how to do things differently, and I'm going to come back to this at the end of my presentation. So first thing you need, when you talk about online learning, is a kind of environment at home, and you can see on the left side in a number of countries that's a given. Not more than 9 out of 10 students are equipped, but you go to countries like Indonesia and the Philippines, and even in middle school, you can see a quarter or more of students being left out. I also mark in orange and red the gap between disadvantaged and privileged kind of social contexts. So you can see also how even home access is amplifying social disparities. Second thing you need is a computer. And there you can see very much the same picture on the left side. If you're in Denmark, in Slovenia, Norway, you can take it for granted. If you go to the Dominican Republic, to the Philippines, or Indonesia, you are basically around 40, at best 50% of young people being equipped, and again with huge kind of social disparities. And that's sort of the starting point for this kind of remote and online learning. Then you get to teachers being prepared, and that's the kind of human capacity gap you can see also here in the judgment of principals. In a fair number of countries, our schools, even if they have the technology, are simply not ready to implement alternative forms of learning. And what's interesting here is that's not just a matter of wealth. You can look at the last one here on the list, is Japan. A high-tech country, has all the technology, all the money, but it doesn't have the people ready to deploy technology. On the left side, you go to 4 provinces in China for which you have data. It's the number 1. So in the same world region, countries tech-savvy, very unevenly prepared for the kind of things that are going to come up. So this is not just about money, it's also very much about the human capacity in education systems. And you talk about online platform, very much the same story, huge disparities across countries between social groups. So there's a lot of talk about alternative ways of learning, distant learning, remote learning, but the reality is really that this is going to work well for certain groups of students, certain groups of schools, but actually leaving other schools further behind. When we've tried to quantify this, but we can also see that students with a disadvantaged social background, they are less likely to have positive feelings of their life, less likely to have that kind of growth mindset that enables them to get beyond the crisis. They're less happy with their lives. They feel a lower sense of belonging. They're more exposed to bullying. They are typically in schools with a poorer disciplinary climate, with less enthusiastic teachers, and with a less positive social environment. The only aspect where we find something positive is that often teachers are more inclined to actually be looking after those students from disadvantage. But here you can see really how you come from a disadvantaged background, and the system around you doubles down on this and reinforcing social disparities. And that's the reality in which most of the young people that we have in the 80 countries with comparative data are really in. So what does it mean? Here you can see the distribution of learning outcomes as measured by our PISA assessment. In yellow and green, that's sort of basic and good. And in red, you have the share of young people who are really very severe underperformers. Now, and this is basically data from before the crisis. So this just shows you the magnitude of the challenge that we already have in kind of peace times. And when I said, red area basically means you don't read as well as what you expect from a 9-10-year-old child. You basically have just, maybe mastered technical reading skills, but certainly not levels of skills that you need to be able to learn. Now, if you just think about this sort of severe underperformance in education, basically those kids are unlikely to ever get on track with SDG 4, because SDG 4 is basically, the horizontal line. So those students are already left significantly behind. If you could fix that, actually, we have sort of calculated the cost. You take a country like Tunisia, where the bar is longest, and you can basically see we're talking about almost 7 times the size of Tunisia's economy that actually is currently lost in terms of long-term added economic impact if everyone in Tunisia would at least reach SDG 4, basically get to the horizontal line. So this is the kind of high cost of low education performance that this crisis is currently amplifying. You take a country like Mexico, and it's still 5.5 times of the size of the economy basically being wasted because too many young people are not reaching even baseline performance. Now, and it's not just developing countries. You look at the United States, also there, on average, things look good, but you have a very significant share of extreme underperformance in that country. And these are only the kids who are in school. I'm not even talking about those who are not, don't have a place in school. And you can really see we're talking about significant economic potential being lost over the lifetime of those countries. Now, UK, another of those stories. Now, nobody would think of the UK as an underperforming education system, but again, when you look at distributions, a lot of children being left behind, and that is exactly what this crisis is reinforcing. And even you look to the star performer in education, Singapore. Even Singapore has a share of young people not on the track to achieving SDG 4, and that is also almost equal to the size of Singapore's economy in terms of long-term economic kind of losses. This just gives you a sense of the magnitude, the economic dimensions that we're talking about. You can add to the social consequences, lots of kind of variables that are correlated with this, but this is simply in terms of lost money on this. The only positive kind of news that I have is actually that we do see also in the data some very positive examples. Let me just pick one country from the middle. That's the Slovak Republic. And when you look actually, and it's a country with extreme disparities, social disparities within the system. And you can see basically here, what you see on the chart is the gap between the 10% most privileged students here in green on the top, and then the 10% most disadvantaged students. You can see basically in a small country like the Slovak Republic, you can see the entire world in terms of the quality of learning outcomes. Some people look at this and say, well, there's nothing you can do about it. But then you look to a country like Portugal, and you can see that the students with the same kind of level of social disadvantage like in the Slovak Republic, they almost perform at the average level. And then you look at the 10% most disadvantaged students in 4 Chinese provinces for which we have data. Admittedly, these are wealthy provinces, coastal provinces, but you can see basically the 10% most disadvantaged students in that in those 4 Chinese provinces do as well or close to where you see the wealthiest students in some other countries. So I think that shows clearly that we can do better, that we can, better align resources with needs. And some countries are on a quite promising track to actually make that happen. We see the same thing by geography. Here you can see the relative share of performance variation between and within schools. And you can see, for example, in a country like Finland, or actually many of the Nordic countries, the closest school is always the best school. So these countries have actually managed to even out social disparities in society, in income, in terms of access to school. You can see on the other side of the equation, in countries like Israel, Lebanon, and the Netherlands, huge disparities between schools. The school where you get to basically is almost determining the outcomes that you're going to see later on. But the variability across countries, irrespective of economic background, gives us clear indication that we can do better. Now, what are the kind of policy responses that we can imagine? I think the first question really is how we can make individuals and systems more resilient. I mean, this crisis is not the last one, and what this has really shown that the kind of institutional structures that we have, you get very, very quickly disrupted and become ineffective. And I think developing more frontline capacity is going to be absolutely key, but also to shift greater emphasis from a pure focus on academic learning on more social and emotional outcomes of learning. I think that's something that we realize at this moment, that we need to get a better balance right in the short term to make individuals more resilient, but also in the long run to develop those kinds of knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values that are going to be crucial for tomorrow's time. Equity and educational opportunity, as I have shown, some countries are doing far better than others in terms of aligning resources with needs. And this is not a matter of level of spending. This is really about basically how you get, talented teachers in challenging environments and align resources with needs. I think we have a lot of really good insights now what makes education systems provide more equitable opportunities. There's actually almost no correlation between the average performance of a system and the degree of equity and opportunity. Some of the highest spenders have the largest kind of inequalities, and some low spending countries have done remarkably well to even out those kinds of disparity. I think the bigger questions in the long run are how can we develop more innovative education systems and draw better on digitalization. I think education is still one of the sectors that is furthest behind in terms of using the innovation potential of digital technologies. Simply, our current model of production is so ineffective that unless we raise value for money in education, SDG 4 is basically out of reach. The economic prospects of countries are getting worse, not better. So I think we need to really look into better ways to strengthen value for money, and that means doing things differently. And technology certainly should be part of that equation. I leave it here. Thank you very much.